Ian is Managing Director of Greencore Construction, which he founded in 2013. He's a physics graduate from Durham University with more than 30 years experience in specialist construction, initially focusing on historic buildings.
Right.
Ian was MD of IJP Building Conservation for 20 years from 1987. And this is where he developed his love of lime, not the fruit, and other natural building materials. Now, during his time at Lime Technology, he pioneered the use of lime mortars in the new building sector and developed hemp lime building systems. Ian, thank you for joining us here today. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you for having me.
30 years, I mean, you know, that's a long time. I imagine you would have seen many changes.
As you say, 30 years is a long time. It seems to have gone by in a bit of a flash. I think one of the main changes we've seen has been the focus on health and safety in construction. And one of the main absences, I think, is the focus on sustainability. Sustainable construction is still not the norm.
Absolutely. Well, look, we've got a lot to discuss today, so let's crack on. Your now award-winning Springfield Meadows development in Abingdon is the first housing scheme in the UK to be zero carbon at the construction stage, as well as zero energy and zero emissions in use. Now, firstly, congratulations on winning the Oxford Preservation Trust's Green Award earlier this month. It must be very exciting for you. I'd like to know what feedback you've had from the mainstream construction industry about the development.
I think that the mainstream construction industry is really split into house builders and non-house builders, and rather disappointingly there hasn't been any feedback from the mainstream house builders. We've had some, none at all, I would say. We've had some positive feedback from mainstream construction companies who are dealing with non-domestic buildings, who are looking to go into more sustainable zero carbon buildings. But most of the feedback's been from politicians, councillors, media, where, as you would imagine, doing zero carbon at the moment is flavour of the month. And we've had a huge amount of really positive feedback from pretty well everybody apart from the house building industry, which illustrates the problem that we have and the problem that we've got to overcome. Yeah,
absolutely. Now, Greencore has described the situation with many volume house builders and developers as crazy, in inverted commas, because most new homes are not being built to the eco standards, which would meet the government's target to bring the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. How does it feel to be a disruptor in this sector?
It can feel a bit lonely, but it's also really important, and we're really passionate about it. And I think we need to understand the reasons why we're doing it. An average new house, when it's built, emits about 60 tonnes of CO2 at the construction stage. That's known as its embodied carbon. And then most new houses will emit a further 5 tonnes a year in use. So if we think about the period from now till 2050, a new house built today will have emitted 200 tonnes by 2050. So it's totally incompatible with an agenda to reducing emissions to zero by 2050. Those houses will need to be upgraded through a retrofit programme between now and 2050 if we're going to be zero carbon. So we know how to build zero carbon now. We know what type of materials we need to use, and we use bio-based materials because they sequester carbon into the fabric of the building. So we're always going to have emissions from things like concrete and glass and steel in the short term, but we can offset that by locking up carbon with timber, hemp and other bio-based materials. So we know how to get to zero embodied carbon, and we know how to get to houses that are very thermally efficient, that use little or no energy in use, and then we can put sufficient PVs on the roof to generate that energy. So we know how to do it now, but the legislation is not forcing people to do it, and the volume house builders are not doing it. So we're not moving in the right direction yet.
So, I mean, this industry really needs disrupting, doesn't it? Even though you're a reluctant disruptor.
It does. I wish somebody else would disrupt it, but in the absence of that, it's us at Greencore. And sometimes it feels lonely, sometimes it feels great.
Is there a weight of responsibility on your shoulders because of that?
I think there is, yes, although we don't think about it on a day-to-day basis. But if we weren't here doing it, who would be doing it?
No, exactly. Your mission is to change the way the mainstream construction industry builds houses to help with the climate change emergency, which we've all been hearing a lot about recently. Realistically, do you think it's possible to do this anytime soon when there are extra cost implications involved?
Well, first of all, I don't think there are extra costs involved. There's a learning curve that everybody has to go through, and most education carries a cost. But once you're through that learning curve, I don't think it costs any more to build zero carbon houses to conventional houses. So the sooner the volume house builders step up and go through that learning curve, the sooner they'll come through the other side. I think it will happen soon. How many houses do we need to build before the mainstream starts to take notice? We've identified a figure and said we want to build 500 in Oxfordshire over the next 5 years. Is that enough for people to take notice? I hope so. Maybe they'll take notice before, maybe we'll have to build a few more. But there is a tipping point where people can no longer ignore it. So I think the first thing is we've got to show it can be done. Second thing is we've got to get the message out there, and we've got to do it at volume, and then the legislation has got to catch up and start forcing people to do it. But it is possible. I think it'll be somewhere in the next 5 to 15 years that it will happen, but really by 2035 we absolutely have to be getting everybody to do this.
So you mentioned you're building around 500 new homes in Oxfordshire. Whereabouts in Oxfordshire will these new homes be?
Well, that's one of the challenges. Most of the land in Oxfordshire that's suitable for building is either owned by or controlled by the volume house builders. So the people who are going to be leading the way are local authorities, housing associations and private landowners. And we're working with a number of those to identify land, to put commercial arrangements in place, and then of course we've got to get planning consent on those houses. So I can't tell you exactly at the moment, but we're working on probably enough sites that could deliver 1,500 to 2,000 houses if they were all successful through that process.
Oh, so they're not small sort of brownfield infill sites then?
Some of them are brownfield, but none of them are particularly small. Unfortunately, the time for doing small projects has passed. We have to be doing this at scale, so we've got to be doing projects of 50 to 200 houses at a time, really.
Okay. My next question is about passive house homes, but in case any of us are unfamiliar with the term, what essentially is a passive house?
A passive house is one that follows a standard that was developed in Germany about 30 years ago, and it's basically using physics and building physics to work out the heat gains and losses of a house in order to get a house that needs less than 15 kilowatt hours of heating for each square metre of its floor area. So it's reducing the heating demand of a house by a factor of somewhere between 5 and 10 compared to normal housing. And it's things like high levels of insulation, designing out thermal bridges, which is where you've got bits of structure that run through from inside to outside and conduct heat through the wall, having triple glazed windows, making the house very airtight. Most heat in houses is lost actually through drafts and unwanted drafts. And then having made the house airtight, it's putting a ventilation system in place that brings in fresh air and takes out stale air, but extracts the heat in the process so that you're not losing heat when you ventilate the house and bring fresh air in. So a series of fairly simple steps that if you do them consistently well, you'll get to that level of energy use.
Yeah. One of the issues in building passive house or eco-friendly homes is that planning regulations can be outdated. For example, planning consent needs to be obtained for solar panels on the roof of a home. And this can take months. You know, what changes would you like to see to the planning regime to help bring forward eco-construction more quickly and efficiently?
Yes, very good question. There Several things. So we need to change the national planning policy framework, which is quite a few years old now and is really set up to deliver large numbers of standard housing. And we can't carry on with business as usual. So that needs to be changed, but that's a long, slow process. So in the meantime, local authorities can adopt supplementary planning guidance, and we've been working with Friends of the Earth from Oxford to produce that guidance, and it's gone out to all the local authorities in Oxfordshire with a plea for them to adopt it.
And this is recently, is it?
This was actually over a year ago. It went out July 2020. It went out. It hasn't been adopted yet, but if it is adopted, it will help the planning officers to be able to support eco-housing. I think generally planning officers all like the idea of eco-housing, but they are policing a system that doesn't favour it. So they're good at following the rules, but the rules are not the rules that will encourage eco-housing. So supplementary planning documents and guidance could speed up the process, but we could also do things that change the economics. So every time you get planning permission on a new house, there's a thing called a community infrastructure levy, or CIL, that you have to pay, and that is a flat fee according to the floor area of the house.
This is that the developer has to pay.
The developer has to pay that, and if that was a tiered system, a bit like car tax on an electric vehicle is zero, car tax on a big petrol guzzling V8 is very expensive. Imagine if CIL was little or zero for a passive house and was a little bit more expensive for ordinary building regs compliant houses. The economics would start to push even mainstream developers towards the passive house route, and then you'd gather some economic momentum, not just legislation that was driving it. I think that is within the planning system, but also outside the planning system. We have stamp duty. Every time somebody buys a house, they pay stamp duty on it. And if every new house that was built to passive house standards had a reduced or zero stamp duty, we saw it during the pandemic that the government can play around with stamp duty, then developers would start building zero carbon and passive houses because they'd be easier to sell. And so simple economics says we should support the things that we want people to do and make it more expensive to do the things we don't want people to do. So I think there are some pretty basic steps that could be taken to just level the playing field in the first place, and then to tip it in the direction of eco-housing rather than volume housing that we're doing at the moment.
And are these incentives being talked about, in the corridors of power?
Well, they're being talked about every time I get the opportunity to speak to a councillor or a politician. How far they go beyond that, I don't know. But
seems a good idea.
I will keep going on about it.
Good for you. This has been an incredibly difficult year for us all, as we all know. Now, how has the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent lockdown affected your business and construction generally?
It has been a very difficult year for everybody. In our case, it basically halved the volume of work that we were doing and our turnover, and cost us an awful lot of money. But I think the positive thing that's come out of it is that there's now a greater awareness that there are things that human beings can't control, the pandemic being one of them, but climate change being another. If we think the pandemic was bad, wait until we start to get more serious climate change than we have at the moment. It's going to get worse, and I think there's a much greater awareness about that now, and I think it will speed up the transition that we need to go through.
In terms of your company's personal journey, did it hit Greencore hard?
Yes, I think it cost us £1 million.
Oh, that is tough. How do you come back from that?
We are very fortunate that we have very supportive investors behind Greencore, but it's also delayed the scale up. That plan I talked about of delivering 500 houses, we actually launched that in January 2020. 29th of January there was the launch, and the pandemic hit in March 2020. So it's delayed us by at least a year, if not 18 months in that process.
Well, hopefully you can regain traction on it going forward now, fingers
I'm
crossed.
absolutely certain we can, yes.
And finally, we can't have you here and not talk about COP26. It's been all over the headlines, all over the press, TV and media for at least the last couple of weeks. What have been the main takeaways from the summit for you? Do you think overall it's been a success?
Yes, I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer that question. I think it's, in some ways, it's delivered some good outcomes. It's always going to be more disappointing and less than we had all hoped for. I think what it's really shown us is it's another stepping stone. I think we all hoped that this COP was going to be the one that delivered the breakthrough to the 1.5 degree threshold. It doesn't look as if it's done that, but it looks as if it's been a step on the journey and will hopefully keep the momentum. But it's still only headlines and commitments and promises, and it's how we deliver those. Certainly the UK government has got some fantastic targets, but now they need to deliver the plans of how they deliver those targets. 78% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2035 is far in excess of what I thought the UK would do. But how are we going to do it? What's the detail that goes behind that? We've got in Oxfordshire, well, actually all local authorities now have carbon budgets. And if you add together the 4 local authorities and the City Council in Oxfordshire, we've got a budget of 26.3 million tonnes. That's the amount of CO2 that we're allowed to emit from now until the end of the century in order to hit that threshold. New housing alone could use somewhere between 80 and 100% of that in the next 10 years. And that's got to cover existing buildings, infrastructure, transport, industry, agriculture, everything else that's going on in the county as well. So business as usual, particularly in the house building sector, cannot carry on, because we will just squander our carbon budgets in the next decade if we're not careful.
We're really at that tipping point, aren't we?
We are, yes.
And less talking and more doing, I think, is the big message for us all, really, isn't it?
I think it is, absolutely. Now's the time for action.
Ian, it's been really interesting hearing your thoughts today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.